I'm calling the Catherine Delahunty.
Mr Speaker, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to take a call on behalf of the Green Party and also to confess, as that seems to be what the House is doing, that I didn't have a student loan. I went to Victoria University and it cost $100 a year, and we didn't value our education any less because we were not indebted. We actually really appreciated the opportunity to see a country where the government invested in the students, and we went to university and took it seriously and got a lot out of it. And then we had the opportunity, my privileged generation had the opportunity to buy homes, to have children without worrying if we could afford it, and to value our education without the perverse incentives that are now built into the student loan scheme and that are affected by this bill. So my word of the week, Mr Speaker, is omni-shambolic, and it actually describes the student loan scheme, which has now become so omni-shambolic that many people can't understand it, let alone interact with it honestly and fairly. And although this bill, as others have said, changes a couple of things that are not necessarily objectionable, we will not be supporting it because, yet again, it fails. It fails to deal with the substantive issues that make the student loan scheme such a mess and such an albatross around the neck of the next generation from me, who weren't lucky enough to be born in a time when we got basically a free education. So the tinkering, the contradictions, the inconsistencies, Mr Speaker, will continue. There will be more bills like this before the House because this omni-shambolic mess is going to continue to need changes made as the tax system changes, as people's working for families and other mechanisms change, and because the government does keep changing the goalposts on student loans, including increasing the amount of repayments. And one of the reasons we have a problem with aspects of the redefinition of income is that for working for families, the increase of repayment rates didn't take into account the increase of rates from 10% to 12% of income, and so working for families, people are being penalised. And as we all know, those of us, the people who get working for families, it's hard enough to live without any more additional debt and complication. And so the real solution to the incapacity, confusion and inequity which affects the student loan scheme is not here. And I believe we'll be back before this House having to modify again. There will be more student loan number 2, number 3, as we continue to try and fix up the mess without dealing with what is, in fact, system failure. And system failure is not addressed in this bill, and the $12 billion albatross is around the neck of so many families, including my own, members of my family, and it gets heavier and heavier as the cost of living goes up. It gets harder and harder for people to say, I can afford to have an education. What was once something that everyone in this country thought they were entitled to is now something that they're only entitled to if they're prepared to live in debt. And one of the really perverse incentives behind the student loan scheme is to normalise debt. So, call me old-fashioned, but I grew up in a generation where you didn't borrow and you didn't live in debt. And now the government says it's the right thing to do. Indebt yourself at an early age. Get a credit card to pay for your food because we're saying that you're not worth investing in for a proper public education, and that will be fine. And what that has done to a generation of younger people is to normalise debt. So living in debt and having credit cards and having to borrow a great deal and living in that false universe where you're never quite keeping up and you don't really know what you've got, and maybe you can't afford to take the next steps in your life and you're not really in control of your finances, that's now normal. And when we were young, we didn't have credit cards, but we usually knew what we had in our pockets. Now, the government says being in debt is a good thing, and you've got to pay it back, otherwise you're reneging. There is no sense of a social contract between young people and the government, and that's why the Green Party is popular on campus. That's why people come and talk to us, because they know that we appreciate that actually, as a generation, they have a right to exist without debt. That debt is actually something that you may take on in later life when you've got a job, and may take on in later life when you're paying off a mortgage, but when you're 18 to 22, you shouldn't live in debt. So there's perverse incentives. On the one hand, there's a philosophy that says there is no common good. On the other hand, there is the perverse incentive of creating generation debt. And so we can't support this bill because it does nothing to fix it.
I call Louise Upston.
Speaker,